My name is Susan Cohen. I'm the founding coordinator of the landscape design series. I'm the coordinator of the landscape design series and the founding coordinator of the portfolio series, which has been going on, as Barbara Corcoran reminded me today, for 23 years, which doesn't seem like a long time, but it was enough time for my children to have children, which seems quite extraordinary to me. So thank you to all those at NYBG who've been helping on this series for all these years, who have made it happen. Thank you to the Humboldt Foundation and family for your contribution over the years to this series. And thank you all who are attending for supporting this long-running educational series. This year, our theme is Places for People. And so it's really appropriate that our first speaker is Lisa Switkin, who has created multiple and very well-known places for people over a career of over 20 years. As you all know, she is a senior principal at Field Operations, and she's led many of the firm's most complex, bold, and transformative projects and reshaped New York's public realm. She's going to be discussing new forms of public space that foster environmental health and resilience, social cohesion, and well-being and connection to place. She will examine cohabitation, the title of her talk, and our evolving human relationship with nature. The projects she'll discuss include the High Line in Manhattan, Domino Park and River Ring in Brooklyn, the master plan for Freshkills Parkland in Staten Island, and Shelby Farms Park in Memphis. Lisa Switkin is a Rome Prize winner and a past president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. I'd like to quote something that Michael Kimmelman of the New York Times recently wrote. He said, "Ms. Switkin is a gifted and subtle architect." I'm pleased to introduce Lisa Switkin. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thanks to NYBG for this gracious invitation and the introduction, and to all of you who are watching this evening. Amazing that I heard Susan say someone was watching from London. I hope I can keep you riveted and awake. So it's really exciting to be here. And I wanted to actually start because I was inspired. I've of course spent time at the New York Botanical Garden, but I was looking to see how you all sort of say your mission is. And it was to advocate for the plant world, which it does through physical experience, through education, and through research. And I thought about that, and I was really inspired by that, of this notion that, of course, it's about, people and our relationship to nature and all of these other things, but at the same time, that we're also, in many ways, when we work on these spaces as landscape architects and in the discipline, advocating for those who can't speak, which sometimes are humans and people who just don't have that sort of voice, but also for plants and for animals. So tonight, I really wanted to, I titled this Cohabitation because I really wanted to instigate a bit of a discussion and to share some thoughts about really this necessity for what I'm calling cohabitation in this sense. But it's really about a concept of living together with the plant and animal world. And it's not a new concept. I mean, if we go back to sort of indigenous beliefs and synergies with the environment, it's one actually that is a very deep and old concept, but one that we've sort of moved away from and hopefully are now returning to. And that this would really propel this kind of ever evolving relationship that we have with nature. And I would argue that right now there's a deep need more than ever really to design with and for multiple things, right? For habitat and for people and for wildlife. And that all of these create a series of co-benefits or multiple benefits, which really strengthen each other instead of being seen at odds or competing with each other. And so I'm hopeful that, this work and many others who are doing work like this or in other disciplines even, help to sort of create a shift in our mindset. And, from all of the sort of consumption and extraction kind of mindset to one that really is more restorative and regenerative. And so I wanted to look at a number of projects that I believe really help foster environmental health and resilience and social resilience and cohesion, as well as what I think is really important, which is developing a connection to place. So I wanted to say a few things just about field operations, and I've sort of been at field operations since the beginning, since we were first founded in '99. And I think this idea really resonates with our work. We really focus on cities and nature, and our commitment is on the integration of the public realm with urban systems, integrating mobility, development, infrastructure, and ecosystems into one functioning whole. And towards this end, these are always sort of put in contrast to each other. And what we're trying to do is to really begin to weave them together more so there isn't such a stark contrast between the two. And towards this end, we really specialize in four different important ingredients. And one of those is urbanism, cities, buildings, development, infrastructure, public spaces, ecosystems, natural and green systems, sustainability and resilience, community, so people, cultural heritage, social cohesion, civic spaces, and equity. And then design, and really the importance and the power of design in terms of craft, artistry, materials, and specificity to really enrich people's lives and hopefully also bring joy. And this was actually one of the earliest diagrams we ever made at Field Operations to try to talk about our philosophy. And the diagram was really about, collaboration and synthesis. And it was at the time trying to both broaden the territory of landscape architecture, but even more so, it was really about reflecting this networked kind of ideology about working with and being inspired by others, and also showing this interrelationship between disciplines and the expertise necessary really to increase the impact and influence of what we did. And it was very much based on a sort of ecosystems type of a network. And cohabitation to me is really about people in this relationship to nature. And this talk was about, people. So I thought, it's really important to kind of bring that into the equation. And it seems very general, but our work really aims to build community. And so this is with both inclusive engagement and outreach, which are essential and an iterative part of our process. But it's also about doing experience-based engagement as a way to really activate and inspire and connect people to specific places, bringing them to the actual sites. And, this is as well as like intentionally engaging people who are not usually engaged in the process to help really build, fostering and sort of stewardship of the land. It's also really important in terms of storytelling, whether we're centering diverse voices, but also creating a shared identity. One of the things that I found really powerful in this whole, all of us are sort of working, hopefully, to kind of help increase notions of climate action and dealing with, our crisis in this world. And many times the data and the numbers are so overwhelming that it's hard for people to connect. So I think the idea of storytelling and narrative and personal stories and seeing how this impacts people's daily lives is also one way to not only connect people to place, but also to spur people to action and feel a sense of responsibility and ownership, for the land and our planet. We also, at every project, really work to integrate local culture and history. And, part of our work I've begun to really learn over the last number of years is, of course, we're designing for people, but we're also designing for habitat. In the case of the Highline, we were working with 18 inches of soil. So figuring out the way to make that soil, work the best it could to support this type of planting, which is kind of still unbelievable to us today, even though we worked with incredible soil science scientists, et cetera. Also looking at the substrates and looking at all of the different things that are necessary in order to support ideal conditions for habitat, as well as designing for wildlife. And that's looking at both indicator species as well as target species, as well as sort of looking at a larger transect. In the case of Freshkills, looking at the upland down to the wetlands and that entire spectrum of what the different ecologies could support. So I'm going to showcase a few projects. I mean, many of them, of course, the Highline is probably familiar for those of you, especially in New York. And, you know, in essence, it's the transformation of a former elevated rail line into a linear park. And this is, you know, both a significant and unique public space, but it's also a connector. And I always like to start with this image because the Highline had a sort of, you know, it sort of was the freight line for a certain amount of time, and an equally amount of time it was actually abandoned. And there was this very evocative kind of nature overtaking the city, you know, that happened in that time. And then of course the new, which is in some ways a weaving of both. It becomes a new type of connector for people, but also over a kind of rich landscape. And the Highline really functions, you know, at the scale of the city on the one hand, in an image like this, but it also is a really immersive experience. And it's been designed to kind of have these ebbs and flows and a choreography. It really meant to be a dialogue with the city and seeing the city in a different way. And this is a drawing that, you know, is not usually part of presentations, but I thought it was really interesting in the context of what I'm trying to sort of talk about. This was actually one of the first drawings that we did. And it was an inventory working with our ecologists to sort of look at all of the different microclimates and the different vegetation zones and ecologies on site, which were very much had to do with very specific things in terms of sheltered spaces and open spaces and where there was sun and where there was sort of dryness and where there was flooding, et cetera, that all of these different communities began to establish. Some of them were native, some of them were not. And obviously we wanted to build on, you know, the native plant communities that were there. But it's not so different than the cadence of the Highline today, even though, of course, that integrates sort of people as a different layer onto this drawing. But you are now in the designed format. This was one of the areas where there was kind of trees like growing up to catch the light. And so we were able to create a renewed thicket that had a much more diverse plant palette. And now you can actually, you know, have birdsong to the grasslands, you know, which were based on dry gravel prairie species, working very closely with Pete Udoff, which also has a seasonality and a texture. So throughout the year, you get this really different experience and range. And it's not even seasons, it's almost daily. There's like a different type of experience based on the plants, et cetera. Looking at areas and their relationship, again, this was one of the only spaces that was open to the river. And so there was a lot of sunlight. And so the design here very much was about opening up to the river and also creating moments for sunbathing at the sun deck where we knew there wouldn't be future buildings overhanging. And also these moments where, you know, preservation and innovation come together, where you're creating a new experience. And where the Highline, this was one of the old billboards that was really meant to, you know, be not a window to the city. So by sort of evoking the language of the billboard, but creating a new relationship and dialogue to the city itself. And in addition, you know, just the types of furnishing, the constrained space, it's only 30 feet to 50 feet wide, allowed for people to just have a really unique sort of dialogue with each other and experience with each other. And we had done renderings similar to this early on. And I think there was a lot of skepticism that you would have people sunning in their bikinis next to people, kissing next to people, you know, reading, but this is a true unphotoshopped photo. In addition, you know, the Highline, I think, is also spent a lot of time with the development sort of rocketing around the Highline. The Friends of the Highline in particular are really continuing to push themselves to be accountable, to innovate. They're always sort of looking to do more and do better. And they have really found really authentic and meaningful ways to engage both the sort of global and now specifically with a focus on a local audience. And so they've really pivoted a lot of their larger community programs with over 700 free programs a year that really target the local community. This is showing Ariba at the Spur with, of course, Simone Leigh's incredible artwork behind Brick House. There's a really amazing program called the Highline Teens that are engaging teenagers in the area to host their own events, as well as becoming knowledgeable with the green sort of systems on the Highline, including spring cutbacks. There's an incredible rotating public art program, which exposes, incredible artworks in the city for free along this whole line. And outside of the plinth, which I was showing before, really artists are allowed to kind of just engage with the structure. There isn't a place or a location for art. It's really about where they're inspired and how they want to interact with the Highline itself, with the landscape, with the views and vistas to the city, et cetera. And of course, the plant palette, this is just a small, teeny sort of snippet, but it was inspired by the self-sown landscape that was there, but also enriching and diversifying that landscape. So it's primarily grasses and perennials, although in a couple of places where we can get, more depth, there are trees and shrubs. But again, this is part of a larger engagement. And so it's not just about, of course, the planting and exposing that. I mean, when we started on it, I remember some of the first people who went up there were sort of very curious and asking us why we were planting weeds. And, it wasn't sort of in vogue to have more wild landscapes, although now it's becoming more and more, something that people do not only for sustainability, but also to increase, of course, biodiversity, et cetera, but also engaging people and learning about the plants and their life cycle and when to do stuff. We do the cutbacks in the spring so that the perennials hold their form in the winter. Domino Park is another project that I've been working on since 2012. Actually, it's marked in my brain because the first meeting I had with Two Trees was literally a few days after Sandy. And so that very much impacted how we worked on this project. So Domino Park is built on the former Domino Sugar Refinery, which is really a site of significance to the growth and development of the Williamsburg neighborhood and the Brooklyn waterfront on the East River. The 5-acre park was the first phase of the 11-acre former sugar factory, which is being transformed into a mixed-use development by Two Trees. This is the park today. And it was really an opportunity to reconnect Williamsburg to the neighborhood, that neighborhood to the East River for the first time in over 160 years. And one of the most important first moves was the extension of River Street, which is the road that it had dead ended. And so to connect it through, not only to create greater connectivity and mobility, but really that idea was to deepen a sort of sense of publicness so that this wouldn't seem like a private front lawn to the development, but rather a clear kind of public park. And the project went through, the standard official ULURP process, but there was also a really robust and unique community outreach and engagement process. And this included all sorts of different forums, from small kind of meetings to interviews with local leaders to discussions at, different sort of leadership organizations in the community. And all of that process really informed the design. And one of the top things that came forward was really that this park be family oriented, that it have the aspirations to really unite the north and the south side of Williamsburg, which has a very different demographic. And also to have a sort of celebration of or nod to the history and the sort of industrial past. So one of the things that we did was develop the artifact walk, which includes over 30 large-scale salvaged artifacts. Those are components of the inner workings of the sugar refining process. These are just some images. People always ask me about the blue, and this was actually the domino blue that was found inside the factory. And then those were sort of reinterpreted on site. This is actually the columns are the existing in situ columns from the raw sugar warehouse. Those were the original gantry cranes, et cetera. And so this became a sort of backbone of the park, which were really meant to have a different experience and also inspire people to really be curious about the history of the place. Since the opening, the park has really become an important anchor for the neighborhood. It's a place where the community really comes together for both recreational and a cultural destination. It's been recognized as one of the most diverse parks in Brooklyn, and it's had over 3 million visitors. Those artifacts you can see, these were the old syrup tanks next to a volleyball court, which was actually something that the Latino community was really excited about to have here on the waterfront. The refinery itself is really the heart. This is an adaptive reuse. It will be office, and it's really the heart of the site. And this was a moment where we also wanted to have an expression of water, because so much in this case, it was a platform and we elevated the platform. I'll show you a different example where we looked at a different way to connect to the water just further north of here. But this was another chance to kind of, again, experience the water and have a connection to the water with this elevated platform that was built to be above the new FEMA elevations. And that other expression, this is a pier reveal where you can look down into the pile structure and hear the river, the power of the river, sort of the tidal river. It's really an estuary going back and forth right next to the syrup tanks. Engaging with the local Brooklyn artist, Mark Riegelman, to sort of do another interpretation. He built this incredible playground here. And then through a partnership with the St. Nick's Alliance and the Green Workforce Development Program, the park also hires locally and does all of these other things to really, again, build on this relationship with this particular community. It's also been a real resource, like, of course, all of our parks during the pandemic, as well as a place where people came together for protest and to express themselves. And, you know, while it's a New York City park, it's fully operated and maintained by Two Trees. And last, you know, over the years, there's been events. This is the salsa night that happens right in front of the old refinery. And more recently, there's been a partnership with the Billion Oyster Project, who is an incredible organization. And this is including a new water quality lab, which is right here along the waterfront, which is a great way for residents and visitors to sort of connect to the New York Harbor in a different way. And it's also an opportunity to get baseline understanding of water quality in the specific places where the Billion Oyster Project is actually considering some large-scale restoration efforts with oysters, which have a strong role in cleaning water and enhancing water quality. So this is a really interesting and very different project in Shanghai called Taupu Central Park. And I just wanted to showcase it a little bit because, you know, the Central Park at Taupu is a unifying element, and it's really seen as an urban green lung for Taupu. And they're developing a whole smart city, which has an expected population of 29,000 people. So it's a 4.2 square kilometer site. And over the past 30 years, Shanghai has really been forced to confront all of these pressures of unprecedented urban growth. So they've been shifting from the sort of concentric city model to a polycentric model, having all of these sort of sister cities around the big cities. And this is one of them. And it was really, the design itself was inspired by traditional Chinese calligraphy and sort of movement. But it was also really inspired by the park's dynamic fluid network of pathways and waterways and stormwater management and topography, et cetera. So this was the initial plan for that central park, and you can see all of the development around it. It's 237 acres. So again, it's kind of like a central park model, but it's actually also working to prioritize pedestrians. There's sort of, it's a large contiguous park. All of the roadways are actually sunken. You can see the image here where you can see that sunken roadway and the landform above it. And then all of the waterways are really meant to be a kind of new ecological park. And so they're actually improving the water quality, managing the stormwater, et cetera. This is a city that experiences frequent rain with a really high water table. So it's less than 2 meters below the surface. And so Shanghai generally is in need of a lot of flood control. And so in response, the project's water system actually connects to the existing canals. There's this central valley, and this channels and guides the water through a series of aeration features and cleansing wetlands to filter and improve the water quality, while also collecting the water for reuse on site. And at the same time, it creates this really incredible kind of otherworldly experience. These are then a series of these different islands in many ways that are connected by a series of bridges over that waterway and those functioning storm waters. This is again an image of the land bridge over the existing road. You have moments like this where there's a bird tower in the middle of a very, very dense area where you sort of feel both a part of, but also apart from, the city around you. And when you're down on the ground, there's this really immersive experience, being within these incredibly rich and functional ecosystems. And it's part of a larger, sponge city initiative that's happening all over China. So again, with the topography, with the waterways, you really have this incredibly immersive experience on the ground as well. This is actually a shot from one of the nature play areas, and these were these incredible tunnels that were weaved with local crafts people in China. Really incredible work. The Seattle Central Waterfront is a project that has been in our office for over a decade, and it's reclaiming 1.5 miles of industrial waterfront into a new public amenity. This is the sort of before and after shot. There's a tunnel that has now been done. The Alaskan Viaduct had to be taken down due to structural issues. A new seawall had to be built. And so these large scale infrastructural projects actually tied to, a new public realm and rethinking this for the waterfront. And one of the things, in looking at the full 1.5 miles was beginning to think about how these really connected back into the different areas and neighborhoods, from the port to the stadiums to sort of Pioneer Square, which is a historic neighborhood, to the sort of downtown, and then Belltown. So all of these really different places and a very large bluff and topographical, differentiation and elevation. The project really seek to sort of not only tie along the 1.5 miles, but also back into the city. This was not been easy. I mean, this is just a diagram that shows all of the different stakeholders and sort of all of their different agendas and interests. And in many ways, the vision and the design itself is what kind of held all of these groups together. It also connects Pike Place Market down to a new aquarium site and down to the waterfront. And perhaps, one of the things that is the most exciting is the Elliott Bay Seawall. And so this was a new seawall, which really was done to meet new seismic standards and to protect critical infrastructure. But one of the things that was really important to the city, but also to us, was that it also enhanced the habitat. And it also creates a light penetrating surface, which allows the salmon, anyone who knows Seattle knows that that's a very sacred animal there, to make their run. They used to actually get caught in this area because it was so dark. And so the light surface allows the salmon to actually continue their run. And so here, even though we had a very constrained situation of the seawall, we made a few panels as well as some artists that created these habitat benches or shelves. You can sort of see them here. You can still have the kayakers going along. And then this is the surface at the top with the light in it. And you can see from underneath how that allows light down below. And so you can see here some of the algae and things, again, starting to attach themselves to the textured surface of the seawall. And then you also have, of course, here, our first juvenile salmon, which was a huge success. Freshkills is probably one of the more foundational and very dear project to me personally. It was really one of the first competitions I worked on back in 2001. And it was about sort of designing landscapes of time and regeneration and process, where the staging and the process of making and remaking and reclaiming was really part of the design. It was meant to foster and nurture a stewardship of the land over time. And, you know, the project transforms 2,200 acres, one of the world's largest sanitary landfills, into a new type of public park. And, you know, we imagined it as a place with seed farms and composting fields and tree farms alongside large-scale wilderness programs such as camping or mountain biking or boating. You know, of course, this is a landfill site, so it's, you know, it's ecological in the sense that it's a huge environmental reclamation project and renewal on a vast scale. But it also has a lot of, you know, different layers and constraints. And it's a kind of world of contrast because you have this highly engineered, you know, kind of space. And I'll show you some images where it's naturalized, you know, over time, working with the sanitation department to establish new cover crops, et cetera, that would promote more biodiversity. You have these like almost incredibly unusual naturalized conditions in a highly, you know, engineered substrate. But it was all part of the notion of the master plan. This was the original landfills. There's actually an incredible creek that runs into a natural preserve here. But then there were the series of the different landfills on top. And the master plan kind of seek to create this inner loop as well as connect all of these territories and build off of the existing wetlands as well as the mounds themselves. And these were some of the original drawings from the master plan, including thinking about ways that the Transset could actually reinforce and promote wildlife. There was also a whole piece of this that had to do with changing the mindset as a place that was really about trash and garbage and smell into something about renewal. I mean, even the name Freshkill was quite unfortunate, and we had to sort of, you know, do a campaign that is like, kill is actually the Dutch word for, you know, stream. And so it was all of these different things that were sort of creating this kind of new way to think about the place. We helped to develop these native meadow mixes with the sanitation department and the parks department and the Freshkills Alliance. Also even having goats to help with some of the Phragmites control. And these are actually just some images of how that it's not just all, you know, happened by itself. There's been a lot of things that have shifted in order to allow this landscape to kind of naturalize over time. I mean, it's just unbelievable. They have these sneak peeks where you can go there now and experience it yourself, whether on the water or actually on the landfills themselves. And these are some images of when it's open and people are starting to actually engage the site. And there it's sort of also closeness, you know, to lower Manhattan. And you still have the flare stations, and you still have, you know, all of the infrastructure that's there, you know, that were part of the old landfill. But one of the things that is most exciting is actually that now the Freshkills Alliance is also using this as a living laboratory to actually generate all of this different environmental research. So on grassland birds, on afforestation, on migratory bats, on fish monitoring, they have research labs. They're looking at all of these different things because it isn't fully open to the public yet. It's really been able to be this incredible space for environmental research. And it's also over a migratory flyway for birds. So it's really starting to see all of these things coming back to what was a very disturbed area. The River Ring is a really exciting project that we're working on in Brooklyn right now. It's just in the initial planning phases. But here, we wanted to look at a new model for an urban shoreline. So one that really significantly increases access and connectivity and equity, provides unique park amenities and programming. And at the same time, it's all within this very constrained urban condition. So it's meant to be a counterpoint to a bulkhead, a hardened shoreline, and to see if we could do a living shoreline, but do it in this very compressed situation. This is actually showing the river ring itself. There's a series of in-water breakwaters, 3 of them that actually buffer the waves as well as storm surge, and they provide for calm waters, which allow you to actually have a totally unique experience in the East River that you can't really have elsewhere because the river is so turbulent, even just from the ferry wakes of the boats going down. And those breakwaters actually reduce energy by 70%, and they double as nature trails, so they're actually accessible. This is actually the site today, so you can kind of see there's a series of concrete caissons, there's platform, and then there is some kind of eroded edge here. And then the plan in the future, so you can see how those breakwaters are actually anchored off of those existing concrete caissons, and they actually, again, help to provide the space for calm waters. There's a functional wetland with the tidal trail, there's a new beach, and then there's also some more standard park amenities such as a nature play area, lawns, amphitheaters, etc. But the idea is that you can actually go out into the water. I mean, these were some of the initial wave agitation maps. So on the left, you kind of see the waves, and then with the breakwaters, what you're seeing in blue is the calmer waters to actually allow the space to function both for habitat and for water access. Our ecologist sort of was looking for different precedents, and Jamaica Bay was like the preeminent wetlands and shallows complex. And so while a much smaller scale, it's at the scale of the tiny little red mark here, it was really modeled off of that. So you don't have stagnant waters. The water is actually allowed to come in and move around, and at the same time you get the protection from the wave breaks. And then when you looked at the bathymetry and the velocity and the salinity and all of those things, there was actually, they echoed each other into similar things, with actually certain things even being a little bit better, such as having a little bit, higher velocity, et cetera, for flushing. This drawing is kind of more technical, but it's one of my favorites because it shows all of the different things, all of the intertidal habitats that's happening under the water. It's things that you won't always see at the surface, although the idea is that with the tidal landscape here, you start to really begin to experience those at different times of the day. And then, of course, just some of the renderings, it shows how the buildings are kind of designed to open up. They design these buildings to allow a kind of really inviting, welcoming entry into the park itself, being on the river ring, and that really different experience of really being out in the water instead of the kind of more standard bulkhead experience. You could actually see the breakwaters beyond. The beach, which again is protected here by the breakwaters so that the sand doesn't actually go away. And it also allows for the calmer waters inside so that people can boat, etc. The functional wetland with the tidal trail. This is one of the images being on the living breakwater. So many breakwaters, this isn't a new thing, but many of them are actually inaccessible that are being used throughout the city. So this actually converts them to a nature trail where you can actually get to some of the old retrofitted caissons. This is showing an outdoor tidal classroom working with the Oyster project, etc. So two more, just to continue to hopefully provoke your minds and thoughts. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Kwanghai Water City, because this is a project that has also been in our office for quite a long time. It was a proposal for a sustainable new city for 4 million people in Shenzhen, China. And we proposed to organize the development and infrastructure through really a series of what we called water fingers. And these were meant to remediate the water. It's in the Pearl River Delta, which is mostly reclaimed land and really notorious for having exceptional low, poor water quality. And so the idea was that not only would this structure the city and become the public open space, but they would actually filter the water and, turn what was seen as a liability into this kind of new asset and resource for the area. And so the public realm, these were some of the initial models to sort of look at those water fingers and the idea that landscape organized the city, not vice versa. And was envisioned as productive and not just green and living, but also designed for people and varied social experiences and uses. Those were some of the renderings and the ideas about how these water fingers would function. And then we looked at the first water finger and started to study that, called Guiwan, in the context of the city. And these images we just got a few days ago, which is kind of amazing to me, but it's being, this is being built. This is the first of the water fingers, again, beginning to filter and clean the Pearl River Delta here, and also become these incredible public park system. And on the ground, there's also all of these new habitats and experiences forming for people, for plants, and of course for wildlife. These are down in the wetlands and the mangroves with the city beyond. And finally, I wanted to end on Shelby Farms Park. It's one of the projects that perhaps isn't as well publicized, but it's really an incredible project and one that's very dear to me, that I worked on back in 2007. It's 4,500 acres, so that's nearly 5 times the size of Central Park. And it's about 12 miles east of Memphis. And this drawing kind of shows its potential in the city to be really linked, but it was quite isolated, and many people didn't even really know about it in many ways. And so this diagram was showing how to link it both back to the Mississippi River as well as down to downtown Memphis, and really across. And there's lots of different sort of isolated communities to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. We had a competition, which we won in 2007, where we looked at this notion of 1 park, 1 million trees, and 12 landscapes. And so it was sort of taking all of the different landscapes that were there. There's this agri center, there's a landfill, there's parkland, and tying them all together. The 1 million trees was beginning to establish a kind of new canopy coverage along the whole thing, which was also, again, to unify the park as well as to create these ecological corridors and connectivity. An expanded lake in the middle to deal with some pretty significant hydrological issues, but also to create a centerpiece, and a number of other interventions. And the first phase, which is 195 acres, called the Heart of the Park, really plays a major role in anchoring it. It was opened a few years ago. This is the expanded lake in the center, and you can begin to see some of the new meadows and managed forest, etc. This is showing some of the trails along that undulating edge. The whole underwater topography, the sort of bathymetry of this was all detailed in a way, working with the ecologists to allow for all sorts of also freshwater habitat and wildlife. You create these kind of moments with restored shorelines, also moments to get out into the water and experience the water in a really exciting new way. It includes hundreds of native trees and dozens of acres of wetlands, meadows, lawns, and many of the plantings were actually developed to attract birds and butterflies and wildlife. The park also connected additional trails, so now there's more than 40 miles of trails, and it allows people to travel by foot, by bike, by horse, by shuttle, by boat. I mean, it's incredible, all the modes of transportation that are here in Shelby Farms Park. And it also promotes exercise. The Shelby Farms Park Conservancy hosts a lot of races throughout the year. This is one of them. It's also home to the Memphis Kids in Nature program, and that really encourages kids to connect with nature. These are also some of the runs by the lake. You see them with these incredible kind of old trees, as well as all of the new, surrounded by all of the new planting. And this has really reinvigorated all of the visitorship. I think it's tripled, since the new part of the park opened. And there's also, a series of events which are really exciting and draw on the larger Memphis community. And one of the things that is really interesting is, Memphis has the highest obesity rate in the country, and it's really in large part due to a lack of access to exercise and nature, et cetera. And so Shelby Farms Park has really, become even more impactful to Memphis in that way, being right there in the sort of inner city and allowing for all of these opportunities for exercise, whether it's, again, on the water, running sort of in all of the different areas of the park, biking, archery. I mean, there's just so many different ways to experience the park. And one of the things that I think is, perhaps the most resonant in many ways, I mean, most special actually, is when you're there, there's also this incredible, they have like one of the oldest, like our last remaining bison farms. And so there's this relationship also to not only to nature, but also to animals. There's horseback riding, there's opportunities to, sort of plant and get your hands dirty and sort of have a connection to the land. And I think that all of this has been incredibly impactful in kind of creating, again, this different mindset of what it means to sort of be in the city and have a relationship to, nature, which is no longer really natural in many ways. And now the park is really heralded as a model for resilience, not only for the way that it's connected all of these fragmented natural systems, it's increased stormwater retention and groundwater recharge, all of those things, but it's also reached a diverse and underserved user group. And the whole operational model is also really interesting too, because they've been working very hard to operate as revenue neutral and using all sorts of new sustainable management practices, as well as a leader, sharing all of this with other conservancies and nonprofits around the world. So with that, I will close, and I'm happy to, I guess, answer questions if that's the format. I'm going to stop sharing. That's okay.
Thank you, Lisa. There's a question in the Q&A. First of all, thank you. That was a wild ride through a lot of parks and a lot to absorb. Wonderful. So we can't thank you enough. We're really happy you were willing to join us and to present these projects. We have a question from which is really 3 questions, and I think they're all very good. So I'm just going to read them,
Okay.
and then you can answer them in whichever order you like. What maintenance is required in these parks? You referred to that. Does it require retaining city workers? And you just mentioned being revenue neutral. So the question implies what expenses are needed for these parks. And the third part of the question is, how do the various stakeholders continue positive relationships over time. If there are different ideas for park use, that's a big question all its own. So you take
Okay.
them in any order you like.
I might have you repeat. I'll start with the maintenance questions. And I would say, I mean, every project is different. And actually part of, you know, going into the design is understanding the resources of each of the places. You know, we don't have the same strategy for every park. And sometimes, you know, maintenance plays a bigger role than others, especially if there isn't, you know, kind of the resources and the capacity to do long-term maintenance. At the same time, I think, you know, for those that have a longer view, like, for example, the Shelby Farms Park Conservancy, you know, one of the first conversations we had with them was they were talking about how many acres, because they're 4,500 acres, they were mowing. And it was a huge maintenance thing. And, you know, they would have this mowing regime that they would do over and over again. So while, of course, there was maintenance associated with reestablishing some of these native meadows and, you know, doing some of the reforestation efforts, et cetera, you know, this was also part of their looking at the current, like reallocating their current, you know, maintenance sort of costs by doing different practices. They also were having a huge issue with invasive vines taking over their forests. And so, you know, part of the strategies we worked with their staff actually to kind of develop new forest types that were, you know, done in a way where they wouldn't be taken over by invasive. So all of these things sort of play into it. You know, there is no such thing as no maintenance, I should say. So it's all on the spectrum. And I think we've also been deeply trying with our projects. And of course, you have to have the right partners, because while we like to stay engaged with the projects, you know, at some point, it's not us, of course, who is there to build these relationships with community members. So, you know, even the Friends of the Highline, although they have many gardeners, they also have people who adopt, you know, different planting beds and learn to kind of do some of the maintenance. They have volunteers for the spring cutbacks where people can come and do that. So I think it's an evolving thing. And actually it's, you know, it's pretty interesting to see how even the projects that I started with like 20 years ago have changed their maintenance practices, you know, I would say almost like 2 to 3 years. You know, like most of them are no pesticides anymore. No, so like everything is shifting and it's changing, you know, that level of effort.
Let's see, there was another part to that. City workers, I think every project is different, is what you said.
It is, but I will say, I mean, like for Domino, because Two Trees maintains and operates the park fully, they are, you know, they actually are working with a local group, St. Nick's Alliance, to actually hire locally. And so that's been a big thing in terms of ensuring that they're providing high-paying jobs and training and all of these things to local community members. In other places, you know, it's part of the city maintenance group. Many of these projects are public-private partnerships. And so depending on those public-private partnerships, they'll decide like who is sort of best to take on different parts. And sometimes the maintenance is something that is given to the private entity, because as many of you know, in city budgets, you know, maintenance costs are very hard to fund. They get cinched. Capital costs come a little bit easier. So, you know, that's again shifts depending on the projects and the stakeholders, et cetera.
There's another question here from Williamsburg residents who ask, can you speak more to what you like and maybe don't like about Domino Park? I assume you like it all because it's your baby. And what approaches will be different with River Ring? And I'd like to add that I never heard about River Ring until you showed it tonight. I'd love to know how far away from that is realization and what state is it in? And were there lessons learned along the way in Brooklyn that made you change any approach at River Ring?
Yeah, I mean, I will say the first, it's not like, it's not as easy as like, what do you like, what are you doing about Domino? But I think Domino had a very particular site. It was on a platform, it was elevated. And I think one of the things that we felt like was unfortunate, it's because it sort of had to be because of the way that the site was, but it is divorced from the water. You don't have touch points to the water. And so with River Ring, where we have this opportunity to actually go out and engage the river. It's a lot harder permitting wise. It's a lot harder all of these other ways. But that was it was meant to be a counterpoint and a complement to Domino, actually specifically because of that. And that this is part of a chain of, parks that are all along the Williamsburg and Greenpoint waterfront. And so it's meant to be very different than Domino. Domino, was the first outside of Grand Ferry, which is this incredible jewel that Domino and River Ring actually both flank. It was like the first real official moment where there was a park on the waterfront in that neighborhood. They're meant to have these different characters and qualities. And because we knew Domino was going to be such a magnet and such an anchor, because it was a community that was really starved for open space and had no access to the waterfront outside of that teeny Grand Ferry Park, it was designed to actually accommodate a lot of people. It's a very, River Ring does it in a very different way, where there's all these different sort of flows of circulation, and we're trying to go out into the water and use the breakwaters and do something different. So they're very much, meant to be counterpoints actually for how you can experience the waterfront. And there's always things you would do differently, knowing what you know. But I think generally, I do get the best part about the work is not, the design. I mean, I'm a true believer in design and that it matters, but that it's seeing everybody use it in ways that you never really could have imagined. And so for me, going to Domino and seeing it every time I go, there's like a different, whether it's like the Hasidic community playing volleyball or like, all of these like different things that you never really expected. I think it's just, that's one of the greatest, joys. But I do think this connection to the water, and we heard that also more natural kind of spaces. I think River Ring tries to really address that and be quite different than Domino. Domino is very structured, purposely so, also because of its existing site conditions.
And how far along is that? When are we going to be able?
So River Ring is just in the initial planning phases. It's going through the ULURP process right now. Actually, it has a city planning commission hearing on Wednesday this week. So it's still early days. If it is approved, and that's still a question, whether or not it would be approved in the planning phases. If it is approved, then I would say, it's still a minimum a few years out to go through design and construction of, they would build the park and one of the two towers first. So the whole park would be part of the first phase.
Somebody has just written in about Domino. We love it and visit Domino year round. Thank you for the contribution. So there's a note of appreciation.
Well, it's a big team with all of these, but thank you. Yeah.
I visited it on a day 2 or 3 summers ago, I think, and it was about 85 degrees. It was brutally hot, and the kids in that water feature were just a joy. And you didn't have to get wet. You just felt cool watching them. It's just,
well, there's something. We've actually planted more trees since we started. We realized that shade was more needed too. Luckily, there's an incredible horticulture team there who.
This is a question that probably needs a longer answer, but maybe you can try to do a short version of it. What can you say about projects that help clean the water of nearby rivers? And is there a short answer about that, or are there multiplicity of techniques that you use?
Yeah, I mean, I would say all of our projects, I think you start with a project boundary or a limit, and like the first thing you do if you're a landscape architect is you put it in the context of the watershed and in the context of like these larger systems, right? Because you can't design in like those little areas. I think there is a lot that you can do within your site boundary, right? But there's also ways, and I think one of the things that we try, and most, this isn't unique to us, I think you try to link to other natural systems, and you try to kind of create these, they can be very sort of small, but they're very impactful when you're sort of reconnecting all of these spaces together, whether it's for stormwater or tree coverage and canopy, et cetera. And those start to agglomerate and make a really big difference. And that's one of the things with River Ring, if all developers were to kind of have a more nature-based solution versus a hardened bulkhead, then again, that would start to agglomerate and create kind of a more resilient waterfront. I'm a big advocate to look at regional solutions for regional issues. It's easier said than done when you're crossing all of these different, jurisdictions, et cetera. But I think with water, water quality, there's some very simple ways where you are basically doing like tiers or things that layer out the sediments, where you plant specific plant species, in terms of the intertidal zone that can get their feet wet and do all of those different things. You're sort of trying to recreate a more natural transect, from the wetland areas to the kind of upland areas. And there's a whole, we work with some incredible ecologists, and applied ecologists, especially, to do that work as well.
That relates to, I think, what will be our last question. It's this, a really interesting presentation. Many of your projects are waterfront parks, which you're just talking about. You talk about how these parks are designed to adapt to rising sea levels due to climate change.
Yeah, so that was one of the key things. And, I wish I had the time to go into detail to one or two, but I took a broader approach for this. One of the things with River Ring is that it is actually, meant to increase resilience, right? And so you're creating basically more room for water to go, for it to absorb. There's kind of, not only does the breakwaters actually reduce the impact of the wave energy, but you're just creating more space, and that, in combination with the wetlands and with all of these other things, allow for more absorption. This needs to happen with the interior drainage too. It's not just about the coast, actually. It's a combination of all of the interior drainage, which many people have seen with all of the flash flooding. It's not storm surge or sea level rise, but it's still climate change issues. And then, I think that these breakwaters, because they are constructed breakwaters, even though they're naturalized, they actually can be adapted over time. So they can actually be lifted. They're essentially floating structures. And so I think there's a lot more in terms of engineering. I think we're sort of given this false narrative of like, it's either gray infrastructure or green infrastructure. And in actuality, like, many times it's a hybrid. And like, you can do all of these different things now that allow, there's many different alternatives to just a bulkhead or just a wetland, for example. And so this is one of the ways, or just a sand, dune, that we're trying to kind of do a constructed nature that helps to blend these, especially in very tight urban conditions where you don't have a large amount of space.
One last question. What's your favorite project of all these projects? What's the one closest?
I know, it's impossible to say my favorite. They all sort of are special for different reasons. But, I will say, with both Freshkills and the Highline, they were really foundational projects for me. I did my thesis when I did my MLA of the Highline before it was a project. This was back in 2000, so over 21 years ago. And then the competition was in 2004, which I did in the office. And so I have this relationship. My role on the project has evolved as I've aged and grown, and from being one of the designers to the principal in charge and everything in between. And I remember it when people were looking at us like, who's going to go there? No one's going to go there. And, so it's like the narrative has totally shifted now, and there's all of these things. But, we had meetings at City Hall where they were like, is it a park? Is it a building? Is it a bridge? Is it, no one knew how to even like think about it in terms of regulations and, all of those other things. So, that's had a very deep and long kind of life. And then Freshkills too is a project of a lifetime. It's something that I worked on the early competition, and the first piece that is actually on the mounds. So there's been a couple pieces that have opened off the mounds, off the landfill proper, will be opening in the next year or two. So that too is, it was such a, it's what sort of sparked field operations moving to New York and really starting the real office. And so it has this very deep and personal kind of thing. And it's also that whole legacy of like seeing the landfill literally naturalize. I mean, some of those pictures I showed, the first time we went, it was just Phragmites and or dirt or, the cover of the geotextile. Like that's all that it was.
Well, thank you again. I'd like to remind people that 2 weeks from tonight, the next portfolio lecture will be given by Michael Boucher. That's the evening of October 18th. And the following day, the fantastic Daryl Morrison will be at the Garden October 19th in person at 1 p.m. as part of our landscape design alumni series. So we hope that everyone can attend one or both of those events. And Lisa, thank you again so much. It was a great pleasure to have you here, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, next time in person, hopefully. But it's fun to share my home with you. My kids didn't bother you, so great.
That's a deal.
I know. No,
Right.
thanks so much, everyone. Hope you have a great night.
Thank you, everybody, and good night.